I'm Sabina Vaught, and I welcome you all to the fourth talk in this spring series of dialogues with guests whose experiences and knowledge support all of us in deepening our understanding of the very long struggle for a free Palestine and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide a century in the making and horrifically accelerated over the last many months. We're also here to do far more than deepen our understanding. We convene to learn how to take meaningful action, how to strengthen our ongoing action, and how to collectively build forward. Many thanks for the support on this series to my wonderful colleagues from the Center for Urban Education, Dr. Elon Dancy, Executive Director, Christy McGuire, Community Engagement Program Manager, and Emily Conklin, Center Administrator. Today, I'm so honored to be welcoming Marc Lamont Hill for this pre-recorded conversation. Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is a cultural anthropologist, critical policy scholar, and radical educator whose work explores issues of race, education, citizenship, and state violence in the United States and Middle East. He is professor of urban education at CUNY Graduate Center. For 2 decades, Hill has conducted ethnographic research inside and outside of formal educational contexts. His scholarship has been situated across multiple strands. First, within informal and everyday educational spaces, spotlighting how Black communities transmit, quote, unofficial intellectual traditions, nurture individual and collective identities, and develop oppositional politics. Second, Hill's ethnographic research is situated in the geographic and political Middle East, where he has studied the experiences of Afro-descendant communities, including in East Jerusalem's Old City, exploring racialization, citizenship, and anti-Blackness among the Afro-Palestinian community. His research in Beta Israel, Afro-Bedouin, and African Hebrew Israelite of Jerusalem communities provided the foundation for the film Black in the Holy Land. Hill is also a critical policy analyst who examines the role of U.S. policy in the expansion and fortification of the American carceral state. This scholarship has resulted in several books, including Nobody, America's War on the Vulnerable from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond, We Still Here, Pandemics, Policing, Protest, and Possibility, Gentrifier, and Seen and Unseen, Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice. Additionally, his critical policy work explores U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly in occupied Palestine. This work includes Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, winner of the 2021 Palestine Book Award. And finally, Marc is a longtime TV political commentator and journalist and host of several TV news programs, including HuffPost Live and Al Jazeera English. Marc, thank you so much for joining us today for the conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I want to start us off by just asking you if you'd share some background for those who don't know your story on your very long engagement in the struggle for a free Palestine.
Well, I grew up as a reader, and I came into my sort of political consciousness like everybody else in waves and stages. But the most powerful moment, the most transformative moment for me was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. After reading Malcolm X's story, I did multiple things. I shifted my consciousness. I recognized the power and value of reading as a liberatory practice, more so than I ever had before. I went around the corner to Masjid Bawa Muhyiddin. I took my Shahada and became Muslim. I joined Black nationalist organizations. And I always say after reading Malcolm, I've just never been the same. I've never been the same. So reading Malcolm's autobiography also led me to follow Malcolm's political life beyond the autobiography, which in many ways is a work of a carefully curated representation of his life. There are inaccuracies, there are mistakes, there are shortcomings, there are, legitimate sites of criticism and outrage and even skepticism and dismissal. All that said, I I kept following Malcolm. And one of the places that my journey took me as I followed Malcolm was into the world of Black internationalism. I became committed to understanding what it meant to not just participate in a domestic struggle for human freedom and liberation and self determination, but what it meant to engage in a global struggle. I began to consider in new ways what it meant to be part of a global social and political imaginary that not only had me bound up with other Black people or even Black and brown people, as we've been sort of taught to do in the States, but also with the entire Black and brown world, as we learned at the Bandung Conference, right? The non-aligned movement, this idea that we had to organize and struggle for a different vision of human possibility that wouldn't be controlled or overdetermined by the Western empires. That became how I thought about things. And so that took me to Malcolm some more, but that also took me to the Black Panthers. It took me to Angela Davis. It took me to SNCC. And in each of those people and in each of those organizations, we find in their work a commitment to Palestine, a commitment to Palestine. When Malcolm X travels to the Middle East, his first time isn't in 1964, as we're taught in the Spike Lee movie, where he sees white Muslims and the whole world changes for him. Malcolm had begun nurturing a kind of internationalist revolutionary politics upon his first trip to the Middle East in 1959. That was his first trip to Palestine, which at the time, in 1959, was under occupation by Jordan. But it was also, a few years, 3 years after the Suez Crisis, when Gamal Abdel Nasser courageously and successfully withstood the tripart aggression of France, England, and Israel around the nationalization of the Suez Canal. And so at that moment, when Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's the president of Egypt at the time, is at almost the height of his power, and he's trying to imagine a kind of pan-Arab political, not just imaginary, but an actual nation state, right? Saying, hey, wait, hey, Syria, hey, Egypt, maybe we're better and stronger together. As he's doing that, Malcolm is watching and he's talking and he's observing and he's saying, wait a minute, we need to think about a collective struggle and a collective resistance. He's doing this as far back as 1959, but he's also, he's also paying very careful attention to what's happening specifically in Palestine. He goes to Jerusalem and sees what's happening. He was very aware of what had happened in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians, over 750,000 of them. And Malcolm was also animated and undergirded and fortified by his Nation of Islam teachings. We often erase Elijah Muhammad from Malcolm's teachings, but Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam lessons taught him to embrace a global political imaginary and to think of himself not just as an American minority, but as a Muslim majority. We find out, right, that he's not just a Negro in America, but he is, as we learn from lesson 1 of the Nation of Islam Supreme Wisdom, he is the original man, an Asiatic Black man, a maker, the owner, the cream of the planet Earth, the father of civilization, the God of the universe. Now, whatever you think about that at the theological level is one thing, but at the political level, he was saying we're global and we must struggle together because we're part of the same community. And so when Malcolm returns in 64, in the summer of 64, as he's traveled through Africa, as he's traveled through the Middle East, as he makes his Hajj ultimately, Malcolm had a complex understanding of the world. He didn't see white people and say, oh my God, white people are Muslim, that means I have to love them. What Malcolm rejected was ontological uh, sort of demonization of white people. That is to say that they are not born evil. They're not born the devil, as in his Nation of Islam teachings, but that but he still embraced and highlighted the idea that white people and whiteness were a social construction that did make them the devil. But that it was possible with the right teaching, the right intervention, the right social arrangement for them to unlearn that, as we now say, to become race traders. And so Malcolm took me into the world of Palestine because Malcolm, in the summer of 1964, stood up when few civil rights leaders were, when few Black American leaders were. And he said, again, against the backdrop of this internationalist politics, against the backdrop of this critique of global power, of global settler colonialism, this critique of white supremacy, against the backdrop of all of that, he says, what's happening in Palestine is wrong. He refers to it as a new kind of colonialism. He writes an essay in the Egyptian Gazette in September of 1964 called On Zionist Logic. So Malcolm X in 1964 is speaking out against what's happening in Palestine, and he's framing it as a settler colonial project. He's rejecting the religious Zionist narrative of sort of destiny and linking it to a kind of similarly morally and politically and logically untenable narrative of manifest destiny articulated by American pioneers. And he even gives the kind of hypothetical comparison and says, well, what if the Moors were to return to Spain and say, hey, we were here thousands of years ago, it's ours. So it wasn't just a rejection of the theology, it was also a rejection of the political sort of pragmatism and logical heft or legitimacy of the Zionist claim to historic Palestine, at that time, Jordanian Palestine, and Israel, right? And so Malcolm not only had me thinking about Palestine, but Malcolm had me thinking about what it means to think about settler colonialism outside the context of America, and outside the context of New Zealand, and outside the context of Australia, and outside the context of Canada, which are very particular modes and articulations of settler colonialism. But what does it mean when it happens under the imprimatur of a British Empire as a means of sustaining a kind of what historians of the Middle East refer to as a kind of empire on the cheap, where we're going to control the area, as all of the European powers did, the French, the Dutch, the British after World War I, carving up the Middle East and Africa, right? Like, let me take a step back. Malcolm wanted us to understand this history, right? And say that this is a settler colonial project that is in some ways singular in terms of its formation, but very ordinary in terms of what it means for the indigenous people on the ground. So what the formation of the Israeli government, the Israeli state, the early pre-1948 Yishuv looks like is complicated and nuanced. But there's a very specific way that this is still a settler colonial project and an act of settler colonial violence that Malcolm wanted us to understand. So Malcolm was my pathway in. And then I read about SNCC, 1967. You know, after that, and understand by the way, Malcolm's genius was also that Malcolm saw this before the 1967 war. You know, the 6-Day War, the June War, the 1967 war, when Israel, in the process of war, not a defensive war, but an aggressive war, accumulated the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai from Egypt and the Gaza Strip from Egypt and the West Bank from Jordan. They now expanded the reach of what they would call, or what they did call, Eretz, and still call Eretz Israel. And they saw that not as a temporary military occupation, although that's often been articulated disingenuously in mainstream political and diplomatic circles, but as part of a broader right of the Jewish ethno-state, i.e. Israel, to all of historic Palestine. That's the colonial vision. And so SNCC called this out, and in particular, Ethel Minor called this out. It's important to name and write into history Black women, as history is so committed to writing them out. And so we we as Black folk and Black liberation movements began to focus on Palestine and focus on the Middle East in a way that we hadn't in the 60s, or I'm sorry, in the 50s and 40s and 30s. You know, in previous moments, Black liberation movements looked at the Zionist movement in some ways at times with great admiration, because we saw ourselves as an oppressed people who had been racialized, who had been marginalized. We saw ourselves as people who needed land. We saw ourselves as people who needed a reprieve. We saw ourselves as connected to the children of Israel for Black Christians. We saw ourselves as bound up in the Exodus narrative, just as our Jewish brothers and sisters did. We saw ourselves in the wilderness, and we needed delivery from Pharaoh. In our case, Pharaoh was the American apartheid state. For Jewish people, it was, at that moment, most intensely Europe, where they were subjected to pogroms in Russia and in Ukraine and in Poland in the end of the 19th century, but also at every juncture and in every location in modern history, every place where Jewish people have been, they have been subjected to racialization, minoritization, state violence, social violence, exclusion, scapegoating, uh, persecution, various forms of humiliation. You know, it's not just Europe, or it's not just Eastern Europe. We look at Spain in the 1400s, the end of the 15th century. We could look in the UK. And part of why we didn't see it as much in the United States in our nascent time was simply because we refused to allow Eastern European Jewish people in it because of our racist and eugenics informed immigration policies. And so all of this is against the backdrop of what's happening. So it was morally complex for us. Dr. King only in his last days began to reckon really with what Israel was as a settler colonial state. It was only then that he began to articulate deep skepticism and legitimate critiques of Israeli statecraft in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, when he's expressed that he was suspicious or wary that Israel was going to give back East Jerusalem. And as we stand here right now having this conversation, 57 years later, almost in June, Israel still hasn't given back East Jerusalem. And so this is the backdrop to my political formation. It's that I was raised in a Black radical tradition that was internationalist and had an anti-imperialist commitment. And so that was underneath, but there also wasn't a lot of conversation about Palestine in my political moment of maturity, because we were thinking about South Africa in the 80s and 90s. Much of our outrage was reserved for the Afrikaner, not the Israeli Zionists. And when you combine that with a kind of pedagogy of settler colonialism and pedagogy of and a kind of there's a pedagogy of settler colonialism and a pedagogy of racialization and white supremacy that is shot through so many of the Black public and counter public domains, right? The Black church was telling us to go to the Holy Land. The HBCU was giving us trips to Israel, right? Our Congressional Black Caucus, filled with neoliberal apologists, was teaching us to side with Israel based on their votes 99.9% of the time. And so I had no space. I knew that my politics were different than them, but I had no space to flesh this out and articulate it, and certainly not to forge any bonds of solidarity. And then 2014 happens. In July of 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge. It will be the fourth major kind of quote unquote war and an act of and military incursion in Gaza. And it lasted 51 days. And there was many casualties. And for the first time, and I worked at CNN at the time, we were seeing visuals and we were seeing social media representations. Mainstream corporate media and imperial media couldn't contain the people's capacity to articulate their own struggle and to counter narrate the dominant majoritarian settler colonial racial capitalist narrative of what was happening in Gaza. And so we were seeing the bodies. We were seeing the destruction of mosques and churches and schools and hospitals. And as we learned about that, we also learned that this is a periodic practice that Israel does that they have literally referred to as a form of statecraft known as mowing the lawn. That every few years they go in there, they engage in a military action in Gaza to control the people, to contain the people, to reduce population growth, and to keep their foot literally on the neck of a people who have been occupied and cleansed and segregated and racialized and abused and jailed and executed since the beginning of the political Zionist movement. And so that moment got my attention, but that moment was tied directly to another moment in the summer of 2014. August 9th, 2014, Mike Brown is killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And as I ran to Ferguson to be part of the growing national and even international resistance, we were now engaged in parallel struggles. They weren't the same, right? But they had similar characteristics. As Twain said, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Our struggles were rhyming. And I realized the similarity and the parallel between our struggles when one night we were getting tear gassed by police in Ferguson. And as we were, again, counter narrating the mainstream corporate news outlets that said that we hadn't been tear gassed and that it was just smoke bombs and warnings from police when we literally couldn't breathe or see, as we were doing that, Palestinians in the West Bank were tweeting about their protests that they were engaged in the West Bank about what was happening in Gaza. And as they heard about our struggle, as they witnessed us engaging in these or negotiating these forms of state violence, activists like Mariam Barghouti in the West Bank said, oh, here's what you do. You put milk in your eyes. Use your t-shirt as your kind of makeshift mask to protect yourself. Stand close to the officers so that they can't tear gas you, because then they'd be tear gassing themselves. Run toward the wind. These were material strategies and tactics of resistance, which often are ignored or deprioritized by academics in favor of symbolic acts of resistance. We love a good dance move, a good avatar on social media. We love a good poem. We love to romanticize resistance and avoid the reality that the state is violent, that the modern nation state holds itself together through violence and what Weber refers to as a monopoly of violence. Only the state can engage in violence. The state isn't anti-violent. The state is anti-violent action by anybody but the state. And so at that moment, we saw not a birth of a Palestinian Black political solidarity, but we saw the reemergence of and strengthening of and re-energizing of a Black Palestinian transnational solidarity movement. We saw it as a resurgence of something that we saw strong in the 60s, strong in the 70s when Mizrahi Jews even, who were challenging the Israeli state for racism, formed the Israeli Black Panthers. We saw a resurgence of what Angela Davis and June Jordan and Alice Walker were calling us to do. We saw a resurgence of what not just First World and Global North Afro-descendant people were engaged in, but also what folk around the continent in the Global South and in the Third Worlds were doing. What was Cuba saying? What are Afro-Cubans saying about Palestine? When they're screaming, Viva, Viva, Palestina. What's happening with the revolutionary groups in Haiti? What happens when Nelson Mandela returns home from prison as a political prisoner? First thing he does is rejoin the ANC. Second thing he does is rearticulate his solidarity with global liberation movements around the world, including the PLO and Yasser Arafat in particular, who always stood with him. And so, you know, that moment in Ferguson, that moment in Ramallah, that was a moment of recentering and reorganization. That was an extraordinary intervention. And from there, you saw multiple things happen. You began to see political delegations. You began to see activists and organizers travel to Palestine. I was the part of the inaugural Ferguson to Palestine delegation organized by the Dream Defenders and Philip Agnew and Ahmed Abu Znaid, who is an alpha, by the way. Both of them are alphas, both the Palestinian and the Black person, Reverend Dr. Dancy. And we watched as we organized, and we organized as we watched, and we engaged in conversations about our struggle, and we engaged in conversations about our resistance. And we learned that solidarity doesn't mean sameness, that as a Black person in America, I don't fully understand what it means to be rendered illegible, entirely illegible by the state right now in the 21st century. Now I understand it as the descendant of enslaved Africans in a slave-holding state. I get that there, where our humanity wasn't even legible. They don't understand how to navigate anti-Blackness, right? Which is persistent and universal and articulates itself in various iterations, even those that may not present themselves as explicitly bound up in phenotypical or intuitive articulations of Blackness. They don't get that, but they do know what it means to be racialized and minoritized, right? They don't deal with gentrification like we do here. We don't deal with ethnic cleansing like they do there. But what we did recognize is that we're both part of a violent settler colonial state that will rely on, exploit, extract, and ultimately erase in its quest to form a nation state through the erasure and elimination of the indigenous population. We recognize that the institutions that manage us and that oversee us, the police, the military, are not just similar in type. They don't just represent the kind of normative expression of the normative violent expression of the modern nation state, but that they actually are literally engaged in training practices. They're literally exchanging ideas. They're literally bound together by a commitment to creating security states whereby, or security states in which the national priority of security as a legal, social, cultural, and moral ideal serves as the predicate for undermining established law, for undermining civil liberties, for undermining a commitment to the most vulnerable citizens in a place. Oh, yeah, you're supposed to be able to have a phone call without us listening, but post 9/11, we can't do that. Oh, yeah, you're supposed to be able to have academic freedom, but not if you're talking about that thing over there. Oh, you're supposed to have a social media account, but not if you're supporting Houthi rebels. And so against the backdrop of these realities, we are forced to reckon with a very real vocation or charge. And that is to liberate ourselves. We must dismantle, not reform, not tweak, not tidy up, not deodorize, but ultimately destroy the systems and the structures that normalize the security state, that naturalize processes of racialization that are used to create to create, exploit, and ultimately destroy minority groups. We have to no longer reify the imagined boundaries of the nation state. What I mean by that is nation states, like all things, are imaginary. We are, these are imagined communities. These are imagined formations that are bound up in the interests of the powerful, not the vulnerable. So how do we imagine ourselves differently? These are the charges that we had. And so while I was in Palestine in 2015 as part of that delegation, I became increasingly fascinated by the resistance. I became increasingly fascinated by the organization of society. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and so I was also very interested in very specific questions, and for me, very urgent questions um, about these issues that have been so pressing to not just anthropologists, but anthropologists of the Middle East in particular, around citizenship, around legacies of settler colonialism, around carcerality, right? Gaza's an open air prison, around um, around resistance. And as someone who's fundamentally preoccupied with the experiences of African people and Afro-descendant people as a Black man in America, I was specifically interested in anti-Blackness, as well as other processes. I was interested in anti-Blackness among Afro-descendant groups in historic Palestine. And by historic Palestine, I mean not just the West Bank and Gaza, but also what would now be called Israel, what would now be called the West Bank, what would now be called Gaza, what would now be called the Sinai, what would now be called the Golan. I was saying all in people, all in places. If you Black, in quotes, I wanted to know about your experience. I wanted to know how you navigated, how you negotiated it, how how you experienced this thing, right? And so I began doing ethnographic research there in 2015, that really only stopped at the pandemic, and I still do um, a considerable amount of research with them and interviews with them via technology. Thank God for Zoom and FaceTime and WhatsApp. And through that, I've begun to really sort of, I think thoroughly consider a range of projects. I've developed a range of projects. I've completed 2 studies looking at many of these big issues in Israel and Palestine. Um, and I think after October 7th, I've now embraced yet another sort of not project, but another set of queries and another set of really kind of urgent responses. I mean, some are at the juridical level, right? What is the legal right and obligation of the state, right, and the international community in response to what is clearly a genocide? And then again, as a scholar of education, as an anthropologist of education in particular, I'm also wondering the role that school and educational systems and educational processes play in the maintenance of the settler colonial state, and in the sort of engagement by the state, or the act by the state, acts by the state, or expressions of the state, excuse me, both ordinary and spectacular forms of violence, right? As scholars of education, we often now have succumbed to the kind of cultural studies discourses around violence, and we tend to think about violence in symbolic ways. You always see people say, "Oh, that was an act of violence." Oh, what you just said was rhetorical violence. Um, you know, I pull out my food and it don't smell good. That's olfactory violence. But like, what does violence mean in the context of a violent settler colonial nation state intent on literally erasing, eliminating, cleansing its population of a racialized indigenous group? What does violence mean then? And how are educational processes bound up in that? And so for me, one of the things that was striking, and I know you've only asked one question, I've been talking the whole time, so I don't, you let me know if you would, feel free to jump in. But one of the things that I found striking was not just the extraordinary death toll, right? What's happening in the Gaza Strip is a genocide based on the Geneva Conventions, or excuse me, based on the Conventions on Genocide, based on international law, based on any kind of definition, any reasonable definition of genocide. What Israel has done represents that. More than 30,000 people have been killed. More than 31,000 people have been killed as of today. And even if we accept Israel's generous, self-aggrandizing statistic that they've killed 10,000 Hamas fighters, I think the number is probably more like 5 or 6,000. But even if we accept their generous notion, that still means that 2/3 of the people killed in Gaza are civilians. 2/3 are women and children, which also lets you know that the 10,000 is wrong, because what they've effectively done is say anybody who's a male over the age of 16 is Hamas, right? It would be like if I said I'm gonna suspend all the gangbangers from the public high school in downtown or in Pittsburgh, and then I just get rid of all the black males and say, well, I got rid of all the gangbangers, right? So what they've effectively done is kill the much of the civilian population. 1% of the child population has been killed in Gaza. 10 children lose a limb every day. 10 children lose a limb every day in Gaza. 72,000 people have been injured. That includes uh, almost 9,000 children, over 6,000, almost 6,500 women. And again, I'm skeptical and wary of the women and children narrative, which tends to infantilize women, and also kind of strip them of any kind of agency or power, and sort of erases their involvement in resistance struggles. I'm only saying that to say, even if we conceded to Israel's numbers, even if we used Israel's kind of racist, orientalist military casualty assessment framework, which is if you're a Palestinian male above 16, you're Hamas. Even if we accept all of that, they're still indiscriminately killing lots of people. They're bombing hospitals, they're bombing masajid, they are destroying wells, they are using food and water as a weapon of war. Al Shifa Hospital, where I just spoke to a surgeon today, at one point had the electricity cut off and fuel cut off. These are all acts of collective punishment and war crimes. So against the backdrop of war crimes, crimes against humanity, international violations of international law, we have to sort of think about how this is not just the act of a violent, a particularly violent Israeli government, or a particularly racist or morally indifferent Netanyahu administration, or right-wing Israeli coalition, all of which is true. But we also have to think about how this is bound up in inseparable from a broader and deeper set of necropolitical logics that undergird the racial capitalist and settler colonial state. And of course, when we talk about necropolitics, we think about the work of Achilles and Mbembe. We think about which is building on the work of Michel Foucault, who talks about biopower. And ultimately, we're talking about the state's capacity to determine who can live and who can die, who lives and who dies. And the necropolitical logics of the Israeli, of the racial capitalist state and the settler colonial state are that once the racialized group is no longer exploitable fully, they are disposable, right? Same thing with Black folk here, right? Enslaved Africa, when we were on plantations as quote unquote slaves, we didn't get killed a lot because we were property, we were chattel, we were integral to the capitalist project. We were owned by the owners. It was only when the Black codes replaced the slave codes and so-called emancipation happens, and suddenly we're now competing with white work. The former Black slave is now competing with the white worker underneath the oversight of the white managerial class, as Du Bois talked about in Black Reconstruction. Now we can die. Now we're death eligible. Black people only became death eligible when we were no longer the exclusive property of the state in a broad sense, and of individual white citizens and the white bourgeois in particular. So when you link that back to Palestine, what you see is an Arab community and a more specifically a Palestinian community that is now expendable and disposable as Israel continues to expand settlements in the West Bank, as it continues to periodically engage in acts of ethnic cleansing in Gaza, as it exercises various forms of uh, discrimination and institutional racism inside the state of Israel. And collectively, those practices create not the conditions for a two-state solution, but the maintenance of a one-state reality that effectively functions as an apartheid state. And so the question we have to ask, I think, as educational scholars, is what role does school play in this? Now, as educational researchers, we've been inclined, as at least in the United States, to focus largely on the symbolic. We'll talk about how does the history text reinforce settler colonialism? How does the ordinary in cultural studies, we say how does public pedagogy, from TV shows to street signs to popular music to fashion, how do they reinforce settler colonial erasure and violence and etc.? And that stuff isn't unimportant. But what we're witnessing in Palestine right now is something different. What we're witnessing in Palestine right now is beyond the symbolic. 370 elementary and secondary schools have been fully or partially destroyed. All 12 of Gaza's universities have been destroyed. We've also seen the destruction or the damaging, the severe damaging or the plundering of museums, of archives, of cultural sites, of sort of public spaces, or public and maybe informal spaces of education, informal educational institutions. In addition, when we think about the people who have been killed, not as just non-combatants, but as students, more than 4,200 students have been killed. More than 325 school teachers and professors have been killed. And these aren't all, with regard to professors, we're not just talking about, we're not just talking about people who happen to be teachers. We've also seen the targeting of Palestinian, my brain is freezing, Palestinian academics, right? For example, Rifat El-Arir. Rifat El-Arir is a poet and English literary scholar in Gaza whose home was specifically targeted, and he was killed after he critiqued the Israeli government in the prosecution of the so-called war on Hamas. So when we think about the war on the so-called war on Gaza or the so-called war on Hamas in these terms, beyond just the extraordinary, indefensible loss of human life, but we also think about the destruction of educational spaces. We're now dealing with something that a historian, what is her name? That the Palestinian historian in particular, Karma Nabulsi, calls Scholasticide, or the systematic destruction of Palestinian education. I think it's bigger. I would, while I appreciate and draw heavily from Karma Nabulsi's language of Scholasticide, which I think is incredibly helpful, it's not just a systemic destruction of Palestinian education, right? It's more than that. It's a set of processes that don't just destroy education, because that still focuses on sort of formal institutions and state-sanctioned pedagogical practices. I would argue that Scholasticide is a form of settler colonial violence committed to manipulating, undermining, or altogether erasing both formal and formal pedagogical practices uh, formal and informal educational institutions, um, and uh, surveilling, policing, threatening, and killing um, educational various any reason any individuals or both individuals and limiting sort of any individual within an education individuals within um, any individual within an educational community that is deemed a threat to state power. That's what I want to say. Sorry. I'm thinking like a writer, so I'm trying to make the sentence perfect. I guess I don't need to. Um, and for me, that plays out in several ways. One is destroying the built environment. They're literally destroying the schools, as we just talked about. Um, they're destroying the built environment. The built environment is is important not just because for practical reasons, like we need a school to sit in, we need a classroom to sit in, we need chairs to sit on, but also because there are the built environments themselves have pedagogical power. The way a building is shaped, um, what's inside of it, what materials we use to construct it, how much money we've invested in maintaining it. All of it offers a kind of pedagogy of possibility, a pedagogy of value, a pedagogy of worth, a pedagogy of possibility about what can happen in this space. So what happens when the Palestinian educational system, which is sort of advanced and sustained and embodied through these school buildings, as it is in most societies, are reduced to rubble? What does it say about the possibility, right? And this is combined with the destruction of the bookstores and the destruction of the museums and the destruction of the archives. So it's not just that y'all don't have anywhere to go. It's also about erasing history. And that's the second point here, right? Scholasticide for me also happens by erasing um, sites of public pedagogy, right? So when you destroy the museum, when you destroy the archive, when you have legislation like the nation state law that came out in 2018 that establishes Hebrew as the only official language, but makes Arabic a priority language, but no longer the official language. When you articulate that Israel is not a state of all of its citizens, but of the Jewish citizens, all of these things serve as a site of pedagogy, public pedagogy about who matters, about who is human, about who is worth investing in, about who is worth protecting. But it also, these laws also have a direct impact on public memory and how we remember the past, right? The Nakba law in inside of Israel, for example, makes it illegal to commemorate 1948 Israeli Independence Day as anything other than a day of independence for the Jewish state, as opposed to a day of mourning or commemoration or loss for um, for the Palestinians. So the scholasticide in that context is not just about destroying the school or destroying the school books. It's about creating a set of a juridical, a legal apparatus that makes it illegal to remember the past in ways that will allow for a critique of a Jewish ethno state, and that could potentially galvanize or foment a principled a principled and successful resistance to these social arrangements. And then lastly, um, again, as I said before, sort of physically executing students and teachers as sites of resistance. You know, we talk about the cancel culture. We talk about the United States, the war on teachers and the war on free speech and teachers getting they're executing these people in their house. Now, I'm not saying that just to say, oh, they got it much harder in Gaza, but to say that we may need to recalibrate um, our our measures of assessment when we talk about violence and state violence and what that might mean. Um, um, and so this is what scholasticide looks like. And I think that the argument for scholasticide is helpful for multiple reasons. One, it helps us really unpack and understand the various ways that um, that settler colonial violence is pursued and prosecuted by the modern nation state, by the settler colonial state. It's they kill a lot of people, but they also destroy all your buildings. They also destroy all your structures. They destroy all sites of memory. Because the idea here, as has been the case since the beginning of the Zionist project, is to frame this as a fait accompli, right? Netanyahu talks about the violence on the ground, the facts on the ground. And the idea is to say that we can't go back to a previous past because it just is what it is. But now it's also to say we don't remember the previous moment. We don't remember the past. We don't allow for a past to be shaped, right? We don't want you to remember the villages that were burned and razed like Deir Yassin. We don't want you to remember Palestinian freedom fighters. We don't want you to understand the real history of the Zionist movement, uh, you know. And so against the backdrop of all of this, educational researchers are challenged to do some things, right? We have to, one, develop an international framework for thinking about resistance and oppression, and domination and resistance. Let me say it like that. I think we also have to. I think this demands that we sort of shift away from, our kind of retreat into sort of empty, symbolic cultural politics as as the center of our analyses, and not look at material, concrete, tangible, and fungible, or tangible, not fungible, tangible forms of violence that are affecting us, right? So in terms in a US context, that would mean let's not just talk about the teacher that looked at us wrong, which is important. We should not just talk about the history textbook that's being banned or erased, although we have to talk about that. Let's also talk about the physical destruction of the built environment when our schools are being closed and transformed, or in places like Chicago or Philly, or transformed into loft apartments. What does it mean when our students aren't just being surveilled and monitored and sort of prepared discursively for the prison, but that they're actually the school is now serving as a site of caging, right? At the same time, we do have to look at how, for Black people, for queer people, for trans people, for disabled people, for indigenous people, our textbooks are sites of violence and scholasticide designed to disarm us of the requisite knowledge that is essential for organizing and actualizing a resistance movement that is not symbolic but material, right? If we keep saying the textbook is wrong because it won't let us talk about slavery properly, that's cool. We do need to write new textbooks. We do need to reshape the curriculum. Those are important things. But we also have to think about other maybe material concerns. We have to think about sort of not just how to change that textbook, but to think about the movements that are designed to kill us, the movements designed to erase us, to hide us. And those things can't be fixed through cultural politics. They can't be fixed by simply writing a better curriculum or engaging in a kind of counter narration of a dominant story. All independent, all indispensable stuff. But we also need, as Malcolm X reminded us in Message to the Grassroots, that a real revolution is not symbolic. And it's not about liberal interventions and reform. Malcolm teased us about wanting to use the same toilet as white people. He said revolutions involve bloodshed. They require land, right? Now, I'm not advocating that we all get shot and that we all, engage in a violent movement of resistance against the state. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is any ideas, any aspirations we have of liberating ourselves, of creating a true self-determination model and actualizing that model will not come by simply imagining it. It won't come by simply symbolically resisting. It won't come uh, without great physical and material cost. And the only way to fully assess that cost is to have an accurate account of the damage that's been happening, of the damage that's been done. And in the true tradition of reparations, to repair the damage done, which is our justice claim here in the United States, at least for me as a descendant of African slaves, enslaved Africans, we have to assess the damage before we can make a call for repair. And that call for repair, again, is not symbolic. It's material. And in Palestine, it is not symbolic. It is material. Gaza has to be rebuilt. It has to be reconstructed. But it can't be reconstructed by a Palestinian leadership that enters Gaza on the back of an Israeli tank. It can't enter a space of liberation praxis as long as it is animated by a political telos that covets and prioritizes an unattainable, quixotic, two-state solution framework that has beguiled and bedeviled and completely undermined any kind of political progress for Palestinians since the Oslo Accords. And honestly, probably since the Peel Partition of the 1930s. So we need to imagine new political possibilities, right? We need to imagine new political frameworks. We need to imagine new understandings of freedom and of justice that are not carceral, that are not oppressive, that are not anti-Black, and that don't fetishize liberal democracy, modern liberal democracy. We need to imagine the world that is not yet. We need a pedagogy of the not yet. In Palestine, and here, and everywhere where there's oppression. And the pedagogy of the not yet, while anchored in a radical imagination, or let me take that back. It's fueled by the radical imagination, but it's anchored in a material analysis of our conditions and a concrete plan for liberation. And as educational researchers, by understanding Scholasticide and ultimately forging a principled response to the conditions of Scholasticide, we not only offer our scholarship then becomes not just a site of liberatory possibility for Palestinians, but it might become a guiding framework for thinking about a praxis, a liberation praxis everywhere in the globe. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does.
Okay.
You
sorry.
just, I think, gave us this sort of exquisite talk, this sort of advanced liberation seminar on the building that internationally anchored movement that is material. And I am not going to try to sum up because what you just did, I'm going to be rewatching over and over. It was really just a beautifully sophisticated sort of class in what we might be thinking about in this moment, and particularly in a school of education or as education faculty and students who are involved in movements or committed to freedom movements. So I just thank you for what you shared with us. And I know people are going to be really excited to listen and take notes. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. It's an honor to talk to you. I'm grateful that you asked me to be a part of this. I'm honored that Dr. Elon Dancy um, is someone who I can consider a friend, a comrade, a colleague, and a co-conspirator. Um, at a moment where there is so much political cowardice,
Yeah.
particularly in institutions of higher education,
Yeah.
to which schools of education are no exception. In fact, they are often the leaders of the kind of neoliberal, neo-fascist, imperial, settler colonial, white supremacist um, uh, curricular and pedagogical framework, or even political vision for their schools. They're often the leader of these things. They will tell you that you know they have to worry about the children, that their bottom line is the children. But as Hakeem Adabudi and I talk about in an upcoming project, they're our children too in Palestine.
Mhm.
What good is it to be a school of education and have no response to the complete destruction of an educational system that is one of the oldest in modern human civilization? What do we say in the face of that, right? How do we respond as educational leaders um, to to one of the most egregious um, acts of state violence with the complicity um, of the West, with the complicity of the leadership and misleadership class, you know, with the complicity, sadly, of other oppressed people. Oftentimes the people leading the charge and allowing themselves to be uh, the the puppets for for Zionist ventriloquism is often Black leaders. It's often the Black president, the Black provost, the Black dean who um, articulates better than the Zionist, him or herself, Zionist logics.
Right.
It's the Black leader who will create a neoliberal framework that will provide the absolute highest level of economic efficiency for an economic class to which he or she will never be a part. And some of the Black education intellectual genealogies, and Professor Dancy teaches an extraordinary course on this.
Yeah.
We find that sentiment from people like Carter G. Woodson in Miseducation of the Negro, that white supremacy has been so thorough, settler colonial domination has been so efficient, that we carry out these missions ourselves. We go through the back door without being told, and if there is no back door, we go and make one.
Mm.
And so against the backdrop of that, I can't help but be moved by Dr. Dancy and by the center. I think about W.E.B. Du Bois, who asked the question, how shall integrity face oppression? What shall honesty do in the face of deception, decency in the face of insult, self-defense before blows? How shall desert and accomplishment meet despising, detraction, and lies? What shall virtue do to meet brute force? There are so many answers and so contradictory, and such differences for those on the one hand who meet questions similar to this once a year, once a decade, and those who face them hourly and daily. I'm gonna say the last part again. And such differences for those on the one hand who meet questions similar to this once a year, or once a decade, and those who face them hourly and daily. Our Palestinian family face them hourly and daily. Black folk catching hell face them hourly and daily. Trans folk hourly and daily. And so we don't have the luxury of asking annual questions for a daily crisis. And so many of our leaders, again, especially in the field of educational leadership. I mean, can you imagine having an association of higher education, an actual academic organization that's focused on higher education, and every university in Gaza has been destroyed and there's not been a statement? Can you imagine having an American Educational Research Association that cares about education, but doesn't have a solidarity statement with Palestinians who've lost every school? They've issued solidarity statements before. Maybe there's a Palestinian exception. This is our crisis, and this is also our call. And I'm so grateful that the Center for Urban Education has answered that call and responded to that call. And the rigor and commitment and beauty and success of your mission is evidenced by the extraordinary response you all are getting. People know y'all. People hear about y'all. People love y'all. People look to y'all for intellectual leadership, not just in the educational world and not just in the Pitt University community, although those are both true, but around the world. And I hope that whoever is in charge of these university matters don't just succumb to technocratic logics, although I suspect those technocratic logics would still reveal that y'all are highly successful, well-funded, well-supported, great researchers, all that. But I hope that they also realize that you all are transforming the world in just the way we've always been charged to do, that the best of our tradition has charged us to do. And so, Professor Dancy, I can't say enough what you're doing. I can't say enough about what you're doing. I can't say enough about what the Commons are doing. Again, community, solidarity, partnership. The CUE could just do this by themselves and say, "Hey, we want all the credit, all the support." But they said, "No, we're going to partner with the Commons because two entities with extraordinary vision, extraordinary capacity, extraordinary talent, and complementary skill sets can get so much more done." That's our tradition. Collective action, mass action, fueled by a vision of liberation that's not about individuals, but about the collective. We can get there. I can get there faster by myself, but if I take a little longer and bring everybody, that's the joy of our tradition. And that's what I want to see. And that's why I'm honored to call you all friends and comrades. Anyway, I want to thank you all. I don't want to talk too long. I just want to say thank you. And, free Palestine.
Thank you. And yes, free Palestine. Thanks, Mark.